All right, I call this meeting to order at 5:36. Thank you everyone for being here. First week of winter quarter. Hope you're all good, still mentally healthy. And with that, I'll go into roll call. Alejandro? Here. Joey?
Here.
Edgar?
Here.
Monica?
Here.
Dane?
Here.
Alex?
Here.
Aubrey?
Here.
Josh?
Here.
Martin?
Here.
Lacey?
Here.
Greg?
Here.
Jess?
Here.
Me, I'm here, and those excuses, Eric, and that's it, that's all for excuse. And with that, I'll move to the next part of the agenda, which is agenda approval. So please take your time to look over the agenda for January 8th, 2020. Motion. Alex?
Move to approve the agenda.
Second. Motion, Josh seconds. All those in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? So moved. Going on to the approval of minutes from the meeting on December 4th, 2019. Please take your time looking over it. If there's any questions or concerns, I'll entertain a motion. Motion to approve the minutes. Edgar? There's a motion. Monica seconds. All those in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? So moved. We're going to go on to reports. I don't have a report right now. I'll just come back in a bit. Advisors.
I do not have a report, I'm sorry.
I have a couple. One, welcome back. Thank you all. A few things that we do have. The annual reports that we send out to all our base funding areas that are due in December. Again, as a reminder, given kind of some stuff that was happening with the access to the budget to the system, we gave them an extended deadline. As of today, all of them have been turned in. So we have them, and so Lacey and I are just making sure we can get them set up in a way that you all can view them. And so in one of our meetings coming up in a couple weeks, we'll have time set aside so that way we can go through some of the annual reports in case there are questions or things you all may have of some of those areas. Also with that is, and we mentioned this before, is during the 4-year cycle, the first 3 years we always split up those base funding areas into 3 groups to have them come and do program reviews. So this is the last year of that, and so we have a handful of them starting to come and do program reviews. The first groups will start coming in on the 29th of this month, so we have a couple meetings before they'll be scheduled to come in. And then they'll come in and essentially we'll get a chance to look over their annual reports they gave us. These will all be after the supplemental questionnaires we sent out from the subcommittee as well. And they'll do a brief presentation on what it is their unit does and answer some other questions. So for those specific units, we'll have them in person to ask questions. The others, if we want to bring people in based on questions that come up, we can at that time. We did send out again the supplemental questionnaire, and I have it listed so it's on there, but the deadline that we set was the 22nd. We've already received a couple of them from base funding groups, and so I know the subcommittee will get a chance to review those as well. The only other things is twofold. There are 2 pieces. One is we did have 2 resignations from the committee. Both Tanya and Kirti have stepped down from the committee. And so we've reached out due to other obligations that have come up or things that weren't expected. And I know with Kirti, it's also her capstone presentations are the same time, so she can't be here. And so Faculty Senate's been notified to see if we have another faculty member who we can find to replace Tanya. Her term still goes for another year after this, so we will see. And then Alejandro, since he just found out this afternoon, will be working diligently to see if we have another student to replace Kirti for the remainder of the year. Beyond that, though, I did do grade checks for all the students, and you all have excellent grades last quarter. Great job. No concerns of that, and so you're all still on the committee as well. But those are all the reports I got. And all the faculty are still here, so you all did good. Yeah. No one ran away.
Now we'll move to public comment, first call. Is there any public comment?
On the subject of like presence absence, legislative session is starting, so I'll have a couple of Olympia trips that we'll make them miss a couple meetings, but that's about it.
Not as a public comment, but to add on that, which I should have said a second ago, to make sure that you all are mindful of letting us know if you're not going to be available. Because regardless of the number of members of the committee, the way the bylaws are written is we have to have a quorum of the number of voting members allowable, which is 13. So we have to have 7 of you all who can vote present for us to actually be able to pass or do any business. So again, we have a good number right now. It's not a concern, but if you know you're going to be absent, let us know. So if it looks like we're not going to have quorum, we can let presenters know and push things back.
Is there any other public comment? Seeing none, I'll move to old business, which there is none. So going on to new business, which Lacey will take it away with the base funding adjustments.
Yes. So I think we've talked about this a couple of times, but just to review, what this is a review of the base funding areas and what their allocation is for basically the last funding cycle that they have. So we have been working really hard at getting fiscal 21 budgets for all of the S&A areas finalized. And with that review, there's only a handful that are going to be on this list. And so there's a couple of documents that I'll go ahead and pull up. This is one of the main documents that we actually put on our website. So I want to give you guys an idea. It's not as easily viewed here, so I'm going to kind of shorten it down. But to give you an idea, there's only a handful that are going to be requesting adjustments to their base funding. And I wanted to show you the bottom line. So after this bottom line, I'm going to kind of show you some more detail. But basically, our current allocation is $7.1 million, and based off of the proposed adjustments to base funding, it'd be an additional $111,000, which would put us at about $7.2 million for next fiscal year. So just to be clear, none of these change currently right now. If approved, this would change starting July 1 of 2020. Yes, and so does anybody have any questions about the bottom line before I go ahead and kind of skip through?
Is this annual or is this total?
So this is going to be total, so it's a little unique in the sense that this is actually the last, we're now talking about the last year of the funding cycle.
Yep.
And so this would be their last base allocation for the request that has already been approved by the committee in the past. So basically, not reoccurring, one last lump sum.
FY21 is the last year.
Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So like the last one, sports radio, 9,000. That's
They will get another 9,000 starting
an
July.
annual. So
Yep.
that number's an annual
Yep.
number. Okay. That's
And now I'm going to skip over to this document because this I think makes a little bit more sense when you're talking about which departments are potentially asking for a base funding adjustment. Now, just to walk you through this format, and we'll talk more detail, Campus Life or student involvement is projecting a negative fund balance at the end of fiscal 21 of $14,000. So their request would be to ask for an additional $14,000 to net zero. So this column over here would be the potential adjusted ending balance. And the whole intent would be to end that funding cycle with a zero. And if there's any excess money left, per our guidelines, that money actually rolls back to the committee, just so everybody can remember that process. And that's for all of the funded areas. So before we go into too much detail, I want everybody to be clear that the only requests within these dollar figures have to do with just a few topics. The increase with minimum wage, which affects our student employees or student workers, and cost of living adjustments, which affects our full-time staff, and that's mandated by the state each year. And then the one piece that is a little bit slightly unique is the board of directors budget for ASCW. That actually has an insurance adjustment as well, so it's not just student wages. It is actually offsetting the increase in insurance, which is primarily due to increased involvement. So we basically have more clubs, and so our insurance is costing more. And I'm sure along with inflation of whatnot, insurance is going to go up. So at the end of the day, those are the only expenses that are in this list. Now, there's other areas that are still having the same effects. All these, the cost of living increases, student wages, this affects all of the areas, all of the 55. But outside of these that are on this list, the others had fund balance, so available funding, which means that they are projecting to have funding either basically net zero at the end of their funding period, or potentially having excess funding that would roll back to the committee. Now, granted, this is all projected, but that is one of the reasons why the rest of the areas are not on the list, is because they basically have the funding to maintain operations as is with their current funding that they have in their department.
So I understand this. Carry forward can occur within the 4-year window. After the 4-year window, it goes back. Okay.
Unless a group comes forward and requests to keep their carry forward, which would be the committee's discretion.
Okay. Gotcha.
I might be getting ahead of myself, but how does the projected need compare to the available?
Yeah.
funds?
So that'll be my next piece.
Great, cool.
So before we go into that, the only thing that I also wanted to make sure that people were aware of is that this is actually an adjustment for 2 years. So we have not adjusted any base allocations for fiscal 20. So this is including minimum wage increase from fiscal 20 until the end of fiscal 21. So just to kind of give you an idea, it's not as simple as splitting it 50-50, but if you would, take that for example, this is basically covering 2 years versus just 1. But what Alex was getting at is basically, can we afford this, right? I mean, that's pretty much at the end of the day, can we do this? So there's a couple of different topics that we could always talk about. We could talk about what the amount of fund balance that we currently have that we operate out of supplementals. But fortunately, that's not the conversation that we have today, because this is a preliminary budget, but as the preliminary budget stands right now, we are still projecting a positive net. So to give you guys an idea, all the expenses that we're talking about, that we just listed on that short sheet, are already projected into this format. So this is actually kind of showing already what it would look like if this was approved by the committee. So this being said, this shows that we're going to net a positive $75,000 for fiscal 21.
Which is the end of the 4-year cycle.
Which is at the end of the 4-year cycle. And what this is showing is, you can't quite see, but this column right here is actually our fiscal 21 budget. So right here, what it's saying is that we are using $82,000 of our reserve. But what's interesting about that is this is also going to be showing our supplemental expenses as well. So it's pretty normal to see that, to see a previous year intentionally dipping into the available fund balance. But our goal for budgeting purposes is obviously for governmental is basically netting to zero, and that's pretty much as close as we can get to netting zero with this type of budget. Now, just to kind of go over fiscal 21 budget prepping, just so you guys have an idea, what this is showing is an increase in enrollment, but only by a slight number. So we're projecting about 50 more students at this time, and that number could change, obviously, so this is why this is just a projection. But it pretty much looks about the same amount of revenue through our door, but it does show an increase slightly. And S&A actually shows that more, because the S&A fee is assessed at all the centers, so every single student. If you're hearing things about the student union fee or the rec center fee, those are only Ellensburg only fees, so they don't actually have potentially the same increase due to where those students finally basically are enrolled. Okay. Is there any questions about these numbers?
Are there any separate guiding principles for S&A fees that may be different than the university's principles on budgeting? For example, if S&A is funding 3 positions and the positions are not filled until year 3 of year 4, let's say, and there's $500,000 of salary savings, are there any regulations or guidelines as to what that budget authority can do with those funds?
Yes, so technically, if the position is vacant for more than 6 months, all that funding rolls back to the S&A committee.
Okay, great.
Now, the department head can come to the committee and request that funding, but that would be at the purview of the committee. So the guidelines say that without any question, it will roll back.
Well, and then additionally, I think the other part of it is that if you were to use the money in a different manner, or to change the position beyond what the initial base funding request was, whoever the department head is would have to come to ask the committee, we came to ask for it to fund this position, however, we're changing this position to something else, we still want to use this funding, and get the approval of the committee to be able to do that.
So I think that's a good point, and I know I'm probably going to harp on this a little too much, but none of these numbers have anything to do with changes to an operation, other than the mandated changes that we have with cost of living, minimum wage, and asterisk to the insurance piece that's tied to this.
Do you want to add, because I think it was last year, the board of directors, the vote from the committee to allow that? Was that last year, right?
Well, it's been every year. So the board of directors budget, I think we've talked about every single year. And what that has to do with is they have been, well, Jeff has been coming to the committee each year and just basically disclosing the situation that they're in. So what happened is they had a fund balance to offset some of these costs. And the last few years, they've been saying, we have the funding, but here we are, these are increased costs that are happening. And basically disclosing that when we do get to that point of needing extra funding, we will come and ask for that, to basically give a more exact number as opposed to a general holistic number that would ultimately end up rolling back. So this is basically getting it closer to what the actual figure will be for next year.
And mostly I just want to make sure, not that the others would not have done that, I just know with the board of directors it was very intentional, and so has come and been very transparent that this was going to most likely happen with the committee. So for those who have not been on it previous years. I know you had the
So, okay, so these are, I don't think you guys have actually seen this, but this is what so when we talk about the annual reports, this is kind of a preview of what all the areas will, or have submitted already. Along with the questions, they have a financial report, and this financial report has 4 fiscal years, so their funding cycle. And basically, what we have here is their allocation, their transfers, which is, not really relevant in this circumstance. They have full-time wages for professional staff, student wages, benefits, and then this is their goods and services. And this is the bottom line, so this is the total expenses. And down here is what is their projected beginning and ending fund balances. And so as you can see, there's been some, like Campus Life has obviously a projected negative $14,000. And what's interesting about Campus Life, which is the only one in this list, is this one is actually split funded. And so what that means is that this department is also funded by the sub fee as well. So even though this allocation looks like just one number, there's actually S&A fees that go into this and sub fees. The rest of the departments on this list are 100% funded by S&A. So yeah, so down here, that's just showing a negative fund balance. And so this is, if the committee was to approve the additional base allocation, that's when we would go in and update the system to allow that allocation to go into that department. So that's why it shows a negative. Sub-engineering is also 100%, is 100% funded by S&A. And this has a couple of positions and just a few student workers as well. And so their primary increase is really due to staffing. And so you'll see this, and all of this has to do with mandatory increases for cost of living, or COLA. CLCE is in the same boat. Their major increase is going to be their wages. As you can see, they have a good chunk of student wages in their program, so they have a lot of student programmers. And again, you'll have more information once we actually do an annual report. So I'm really just kind of giving an overview of the financials. If you guys have details of the program needs, we really would need to bring in those department heads to basically talk about their details. But as you can see, here's the negative fund balance projected at the end of the funding cycle. Board of Directors, I think the biggest piece is you'll see this. Their insurance has increased and their wages have increased as well. But they started their funding cycle with $36,000. So they wanted to be intentional about spending that down. And then case managers are actually just 2 positions. And so this all has to do with cost of living. And just to add, there is a slight healthcare benefit increase as well that is included. So even though it's a different line item, we've been just basically including that with mandatory cost of living increases.
Can you go to CLC as an easier example? The one thing to also know is this is a normal thing that we do. So if you look under the allocation up at the top, in 18 it was 512,264, which is what was initially allocated to them. The increase that you see was, again, the request for the committee to increase based on cost of living because of the minimum wage and the COLA pieces. And so the committee does this regularly. It's just this year it was able to identify with all the things that we only need 5 units instead of the much larger amount that we've had in the past of other areas. So that's why you see the increase in the revenue was based on the committee increasing the supplemental funding. Or not supplemental, the base funding.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is something to keep in mind when we're talking about the funding cycle for the next 4 years. It's a little bit time consuming to do it in this fashion. So I think it's something just to be, aware of what that looks like. If we're going to have an average of cost of living increase by 2%, is that conversation of this base funded area is funded? Do we just add 2% across the board? Or how does the committee kind of want to do that? I think this is pretty detailed. It gets to closer to the exact dollar figure for sure. But just keep in mind that even if we do allocate them more money, if there's an excess, it will roll back to us or to the committee. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? It's a pretty quiet group.
It's just so thorough.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so when it comes to student wages as well, I think we've talked about this, but just so everybody's aware, minimum wage jumped up starting January 1 to $13.50. So from $12. So it's a pretty big jump. And I do want to make sure we go on record to state that just because there's only a handful of departments here, that doesn't mean that it's not affecting other areas. So when other areas come through the funding cycle next year to request money, most likely you'll see that they have been intentionally spending down their fund balance to offset some of the increased costs to operate. Okay. Oh, and just to be clear, just so everybody understands, this doesn't actually come out of our supplemental. I don't know if that made a whole lot of sense, but since we have available funding projected for fiscal 21, this is actually coming out of that year's revenue as opposed to dipping into any reserves that we might have.
Did we changed our reserve last year? Is that?
Well, it's not changed yet.
Are you talking about with the policies, what we have to have in a reserve?
Yeah.
Yes, and that is waiting to go to UPAC this quarter since UPAC was canceled in the fall. But yes, I mean, we're still above where either one of those are.
So even if the projections that you are estimating are not as high or anywhere close to what they're supposed to be, will be covered?
Yes.
And I will say, if you notice on here, there's the presentation. Make sure if you have other questions to ask, but we will need to vote, so to have a motion on whether or not to approve this, so to move forward. just as a point of order. So everyone just doesn't stare at Brandon.
The floor's still open to questions too.
Our group tonight.
Everyone's still getting back in the swing of
I
it.
guess.
So you need a motion to approve,
To allow,
To-
to do the
Increase.
proposed increase to the base allocations.
for these 4, 5 groups. There you go, Dane.
Yeah, well,
I,
I think it's great. I think we should motion to, I motion to approve the total amount for all 5 of those groups for the increased SMA funding source.
There's a motion on the table. Edgar seconds. Is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing none. All those in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Seeing none, so moved. I'll let her know.
Great, thank you. So, just for next steps, before we go into the next bullet here, what will happen next is we still have a couple of weeks to finalize all of the budget presentations, but the budget will be presented at PBAC, the President's Budget Advisory Committee. There we go. And they are actually, we are the first to go this year. So we do this kind of in chunks, and at the end of basically spring quarter, it will then be routed up into the Board of Trustees. So that's gonna be our next level of approval or recommendation. And that will happen on January 28th in Barge. 3 p.m.
So moving on to subpoint B is the subcommittee report. Kind of going off what Joey said with the supplementary questionnaire, we got that out to the base funded departments. We also have the deadline for them to turn it in on January 22nd, along with supplemental funding requests for this quarter's deadline is January 22nd. So on that date, definitely the subcommittee will be getting together and kind of consolidating all the answers, going over them, and reporting back to the main committee about the answers that we got and kind of the direction we want to go with kind of like the rubric and like the standardization of kind of like analyzing base funded areas. Something that we need to do for the subcommittee report is kind of find out a new meeting time, which I'll give to Edgar to kind of find or task Edgar with bringing in the new meeting time for the subcommittee this quarter, and they'll spearhead their supplemental funding projects. And yeah, does anyone have any questions about the subcommittee or kind of the deadline this quarter for the supplemental questionnaire or the funding requests?
The subcommittee is to work on the questionnaire rubric that's been presented here.
Yeah, so we got the questionnaire out to the base funded areas, and then on January 22nd, that's the deadline for them to
Respond.
get back to
Yeah.
Joey. Yeah, respond.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, those answers will be looked at by the subcommittee.
Oh, yeah, so the subcommittee looks at all the data that's feeded back to us, and then you guys, the subcommittee would then present it to the rest of the committee?
Yeah,
Or
kind of like,
some fashion like that?
Oh, I was gonna go off of that.
Okay.
Are we like trying to summarize what they gave us, or are we trying to like group them, like we're
yeah, it's
talking about? Okay.
more of that. And then kind of go and see if there's a common theme with the answers and seeing maybe no one's maybe collecting the data, so then we just come to them or with the committee, talk to the committee and say, maybe this is a general requirement or expectation that we want to set for them so that they start collecting this data, because it seems like no one has it, or the subcommittee might just like think of it differently and try to like come up with a different way of maybe like measuring success of base funded areas. But yeah, that's kind of like what they'll think about once they get all the answers. But yeah.
We'll share the full supplemental questionnaire with the whole committee, so you all will get to see it. Again, the subcommittee is just doing the more in-depth work of diving into them and doing the grouping pieces and setting some pieces for the going into next year's new base funding cycle to be able to provide some standards so groups coming in know what the committee is wanting or looking for.
Any other questions about the subcommittee? Seeing none, I'll move to the next part of our agenda, which is other business, which is communications received. Did everyone get the email from Aubrey?
Yeah, I got
The
it.
attached email from Fire and SPLC? Good. Alright. And so with that, I just kind of want to communicate that with Joey and the entire university, I responded to that email. And with that, I'll read to you my response. Thank you for your communication regarding recent discussions involving CWU student media. The S&A Fee Committee is in agreement regarding any concerns of viewpoint discriminatory and retaliatory actions taken against any protected speech or expression. The S&A Fee Committee does stand firmly behind the commitment to uphold all protected speech and expression. As the committee discussed in response to a public comment on the subject, the particular content of funded programs or services is outside the scope or of authority of the committee. The S&A Fee Committee takes their roles as stewards of student money very seriously and will continue to remain vigilant in their role as a recommending budgetary body regarding student service and activities fee allocations. Sincerely, Brandon Webergren, S&A Committee Chair. And with that, I haven't gotten a response. But what I was saying with that was just kind of saying, yes, we agree that we aren't going to censor any students or any student media, and that we aren't going to impede on anyone's rights, and that we are also just stewards of the budgetary S&A budget. And with that, does anyone have any questions, or you want to tack on anything?
No, I think you did a good job. It was a letter that we had received as a joint letter, which is a kind of standard practice, and so with that, we gave the official response, and there's really no other action needed beyond that.
And that response was to the group who sent the letter?
Yeah, that was to Fire.
Yep.
Who sent us the letter.
Their program officer.
Their program officer. Yeah. Yeah.
Other than a lot of responses to the annual reports and a lot of questions about the questionnaire, no one was too concerned. I mean, people were concerned about getting a supplemental questionnaire until they actually read the questions, which was mostly information they had. Or letting them know if you don't have it. Again, we did, as the committee discussed, we gave them kind of a primer saying, we'd like this if you have it, but no, you may not have this data, which is fine.
Receive any communication? Okay. And so, should we just talk about next week's meeting,
Yeah?
Okay. Well, with that, we pretty much kind of completed what's on our agenda for this week. But for next week's agenda, looking at you, Lacey, do you know what might be on next week's?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I'm going to answer that question, but I do want everybody to see that there is also a couple that I got today that I have not actually had a chance to look at. So there's a few supplementals that are in the queue that are not on this list. But as you can see, we've got a good amount with this quarter. And so, as of right now, all of those that are summed up is about $89,000. And just to refresh, since it's been, a month since we've seen each other, we have $128,000 left per year. So I will be continually going through the supplemental funding requests that I have until the 22nd, but that is the deadline that we have set for at least confirming them a spot for winter quarter. So when you're talking about the agenda, I don't know if I have any other things other than going through the supplemental list.
Yeah. And yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that I think next week's, I guess, meeting will be more of the supplemental requests, as well as subcommittee will be probably starting next week, you think, Edgar? Yeah, and then the subcommittee will probably meet next week as well. But yeah, that's kind of what next week looks like. And with that, I will move to public comment, second call.
Is this the time for random questions?
Yep.
As,
Yeah.
as the newest member of the committee, maybe this is answered somewhere else. But
Maybe.
Brandon, you used a term that I liked. You said in your last statement how this committee is a steward of the student fees. And I'm wondering how do we, what does that stewardship look like? And what is this committee's rubric for identifying good or bad stewardship? Is it all individual with who's sitting on the committee, or is it a group rubric to understand and assess what are good stewardship allocations and what are not? As a newer member, I think that's the most difficult thing I've struggled with the last few months, is understanding why would I or would I not vote for funding in the supplemental? And then if we think about next year, why would I or why would I not vote for any base allocation? And how would I assess? And I know we talked a little bit about putting together the questionnaire. I still am a little confused on how those will help me decide what is good stewardship versus bad stewardship. I know personally, but I'm trying to know what my opinion is personally, which is what I bring to the table. But I want to know, is there a group model for that good versus bad stewardship, or if that discussion has happened outside of my time on the committee?
Answer first. It sound like you're gonna say something.
I guess I'll give it like that shot. Yeah. Yeah, I think as it is, I mean, you kind of pointed out the direction that I want us to go and where we are right now. I think as it is, the committee is very kind of individualized what is good stewardship. It has been just kind of like what we feel is good, or like good stewardship, like what we believe should be funded and what should be funded. And that's why I think with the subcommittee and the talks we've had in the fall quarter or leading up till now, kind of trying to find like a standardized rubric or something that we can like prove that we're being consistent and fair with everyone. That's what I believe is good stewardship. Is kind of consistency and fairness to all students on the central campus, which all campuses. And so that's where I think that's what good stewardship is and the direction that we're moving towards. But as it is right now, I think that's the one point that we're in. It's kind of more individualized.
Well, and I would add, in a general sense, I think with this specific funding, you really need to talk about these matrices. How do we, get all of these different areas and compare them, but also compare their impact to the students and the current students. I mean, I think that's kind of like, what is our center goal? And regardless of what we put around that big centerpiece, the center needs to be the impact to our current students right now, today. And what that impact could be multiple different things, right? And that's what, student services, student support, programming, it's a huge area that has a lot of unique areas. And I think grouping it will be interesting to see what those groups look like, because each group is going to should potentially have, right, a different matrix that would be more unique to their operation.
Alex.
And I think going back to the Killian outline as well and revisiting what is the mandate of the S&A fee committee and what are services and activities. And we have a very old outline of what that is supposed to mean, which includes things like Letterman jackets.
Yeah, the Killian is very old.
Yeah. So, point being,
Yeah.
looking at that and trying to interpret that for current students and what our services and activities are, all the things that we're funding. Actually, services and activities, should they be somewhere else? Not necessarily like, oh, should we get rid of them, but like, should they be under S&A or should they be under some other funding body that we have? So.
Well, and to answer kind of the question more specifically, we do have criteria on this document you all got at the beginning, and it's in the guidelines. This is all just taken from, this side is all taken from the guidelines, which really covers two pieces. One is base funding programs, and it gives our funding priorities, which are going to be less important this year, but for next year. But it goes into, and I'll just share it now, that the first priority is requests pertaining to conditions that were not reasonably anticipated at the time of the base funding. So if we have a group who comes in who we decide to base fund, if there's other things that come up. Requests pertaining to opportunities to add, expand, or enhance programs, services, or activities that do not result in the addition of non-student payroll. So essentially expanding programs but not adding new staff is our second priority. Third priority would be requests pertaining to adding more professional staff. And then the fourth priority is new programs that we have not historically funded. So when we go into base funding, that's really where it comes up, is any groups we've historically funded really are our top priorities into looking at those requests. And if it meets the criteria, and as good stewards is also looking at those annual reports. So if we have a group that comes in who has not been spending their allocation over the last 4 years, but now they're asking for $100,000 more, is really asking the question of why, because that's money that could go to something else. So in being mindful of that. When we talk about the non-base funding programs, we do kind of have a criteria piece on here that does touch on that the nature of the event must clearly be established, which is part of this piece that we have them come and present, and be related to at least one of the following. And there's 4 different criterias on here. Relates to the purpose of the club, if it's a club, or clearly benefit the establishment of the club or organization that's there. Has a direct educational value. Pertains to opportunities to add, expand, or enhance programs, services, or activities at the institution. Or clearly benefits the university or a subset of the student body, if not club sponsored, within those. And so really looking at those and determining within those guidelines. So there are specific there, however, it is very much individual, because the S&A, the way it's written in the state guidelines is they want to make sure that there's strong student voice. So why we have those as general guiding principles is really for you all, which is why we have the majority of students voting on this committee, of things that you all feel are important as service and activities for the university at large. So we're not the ones making the decisions because we're not the ones who are going to be benefiting from it. So within those guidelines, it is kind of subjective to what the committee sees as the most beneficial use of the funds. And so, for example, if we get into a spot to where we're sitting here and we have $170,000 left and we end up with $300,000 in requests, and we're just going to pretend that that happens by the 22nd deadline so we know what we're looking at, that means you all are looking at all of those requests and determining which ones hold more value, or do we want to dip into other things.
And has that happened historically here at Central, where we've had significantly more requests than we have funding?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
we've never done the deadline piece. So what we've done in the past is we'll end up, and it's typically, I think it's almost always, I can't remember if we had to do it winter quarter. I'm looking at those who've been on here before. But sometimes at the start of spring, we realize we're at $20,000 left and we have $100,000.
Okay.
And the committee may make the decision. In the past, it's been because we'll have a large group come in requesting $100,000. So we'll allocate that, but then we'll increase from what we set the budget as. And in the past, if you look at the other ones, we've set the initial budget as $200,000 and then increased it partway through.
Okay.
We typically don't want to necessarily do that because we want to be good stewards of what we set because it was intentional for long term. But when we have those larger requests that come in, that's where we look to Lacey to give us the financial, is this sustainable? Are we okay to dip into our reserve to do those?
Okay.
But I would say based on the track we're going so far this year, it's more likely than not that we're probably going to have more requests than we have funding.
Good question.
All good questions. But this is also where the subcommittee, because while we have some of this, it is helpful if we want more specific guidelines. The challenges, I'll say for those, and again, having done this was, sometimes the committees will come in, and these are the ones built into our actual document that we have to follow, is committees will come in and it's helpful to have kind of a rubric of what we want, which is what we'll kind of talk about at the beginning of the year, is where do we want to focus. The challenge is sometimes the committees will completely shift in a year, that we'll get all but 2 new people, and then the whole new committee wants a completely different focus or priority. So it's sometimes can be challenging for that longevity to stay on the same focus. Which I'll say, as the staff appointee, you would be one who would be here for more than 1 year and see that. Hypothetically.
4-year term.
Yes, doesn't
didn't
have an
have an
ending on the letter.
Might be an interim appointment. I'm not sure.
Yes. we don't know. We don't know.
Is there any other public comment? Seeing none, I entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting. Alex,
Move to adjourn.
Jess seconds. Is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? So moved. Meeting's adjourned at 6:21.